Welcome, class. Let's jump right in. Today, we are setting the stage for your upcoming reading on the end of American Indian independence. Now, as your instructor, my goal with this explainer is to give you a solid mental framework before you even crack open the textbook. I really want you to focus on the big, overarching historical questions as we go through this material today, rather than just, memorizing a bunch of random dates and names. We're going to look at why things happened, why people disagreed so fiercely, and how these incredibly complex events actually fit into the larger story of American history. Okay, let's dive into this.
So, before you dive into the chapter, we're going to look at 5 major historical themes you really need to watch out for. We've got the myth of the empty West, a complex plains culture, treaties and industrial total war, erasing the native identity, and finally, the final tragic resistance. Keep these 5 themes in the back of your mind. They're really going to help you organize all the complex details you're about to encounter. All right, theme number 1, the myth of the empty West. As you begin reading, I want you to pay close attention how the author completely shatters that early American myth of the Great Plains being this worthless, totally uninhabited desert.
One absolutely crucial question to keep in mind while you're reading is this. Why did the U.S. initially think this region was the perfect place to relocate Eastern tribes? Well, early explorers, guys like Zebulon Pike, actually called this vast area the Great American Desert. U.S. policymakers honestly thought it was entirely useless for white agriculture. And because of that, they decided it was the perfect permanent Indian territory to relocate the 5 civilized tribes from the south. But notice how the author points out a massive and, quite frankly, intentional flaw in this plan. This land was not empty. The government completely ignored the roughly 75,000 nomadic Native Americans who were already living out there, building their entire societies around hunting the buffalo.
Which brings us perfectly to theme 2, a complex plains culture. Let's explore the highly contested, economically sophisticated societies that already dominated this region long before American settlers ever arrived.
Notice how the author is very careful not to describe the Plains Indians as just a single monolith. They were incredibly diverse, wealthy societies, and their entire independence and prosperity were fueled by 2 main things: the Spanish-imported horse and the buffalo. It's like the horse allowed them to conquer distance, and the buffalo allowed them to conquer want. Now, watch for evidence in the text of how highly democratic and decentralized these tribes were. This is a huge point. American treaty negotiators were often utterly baffled by this. They expected to just roll up and find a single king or supreme chief who could sign away land for an entire nation. Instead, they encountered societies that practiced a democracy so extreme and decentralized that top-down authority simply didn't exist in the way Americans understood it. Also, pay attention to their incredibly lucrative trade networks and how intensely they actually competed with one another for resources.
For example, when you encounter this term in the text, counting coup, remember that it illustrates a culture where warfare was often highly ritualized. Long before the U.S. military became a permanent fixture on the plains, these nations were fighting each other for prestige, for horses, and for prime buffalo hunting grounds. Warfare was a core part of male identity, and touching a live enemy in battle without actually harming him, that was seen as the absolute ultimate display of bravery. It required far, far more courage than just shooting someone from a distance.
And you really need to watch for this fascinating historical irony in your reading. Why on earth did tribes like the Crow choose to ally with the U.S. military? It sounds counterintuitive, right? But as you'll see, there was no cohesive pan-Indian identity at this time. The Crow allied with the U.S. simply as a strategic, highly calculated move against their fierce traditional rivals, the Sioux, who had been pushing aggressively into their territory. It's absolutely crucial to understand that these tribes were acting in their own strategic self-interest, trying to navigate centuries-old rivalries while surviving a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape.
All right, moving to theme 3, treaties and industrial total war. This section examines a massive turning point, marking the era where frontier skirmishes escalated into a full-blown industrialized, logistical conquest.
Look for the stark whiplash here as you read. In the 1850s and 60s, during the treaty era, the U.S. signed these solemn agreements at places like Fort Laramie, explicitly recognizing native nations as sovereign entities with their own undisputed borders. But then, fast forward to 1871. Congress passes an act stating they would simply no longer make treaties with native tribes. They abruptly stop recognizing their independence to usher in the agreement era. Why the dramatic shift? Well, westward expansion, driven by relentless gold rushes and immense land hunger, demanded it. The Supreme Court eventually even ruled that Congress could just unilaterally override any previous treaties whenever it suited the nation's interests.
Now, please don't get bogged down in memorizing every single one of these exact dates for the exam, but do recognize the rapid compressing pattern happening here.
In 1862, the Homestead Act pushes thousands of white settlers west. Boom, 1865, the Civil War ends, which frees up this massive, battle-hardened military force. And then in 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad allowed generals like Sherman and Sheridan to wage a full-scale logistical war out west. They could now just constantly ship troops, supplies, and heavy weapons year-round, regardless of the season. The Plains Nomads were brilliant light cavalry for sure, but they simply couldn't match this relentless industrial intensity.
And that brings us to one of the most staggering figures you'll see in the chapter. An estimated 31 million buffalo killed in just over a decade. Let that number sink in, 31 million. As you read, ask yourself why the U.S. military tacitly supported this unbelievable slaughter. You'll find it was a very deliberate, scorched earth tactic. By systematically eliminating the buffalo, they were purposefully destroying the very foundation of Plains independence. As one officer bluntly put it at the time, every dead buffalo was an Indian gone. They weren't just fighting an army anymore, they were destroying their enemy's ability to eat, forcing them into submission through manufactured starvation.
This perfectly transitions us to Theme 4, Erasing the Native Identity. Notice how the battlefield eventually shifts. Once the military campaigns corralled Native peoples onto reservations, the physical conflict gave way to a devastating cultural war.
The text highlights a deep, painful internal debate among Native leaders on how to even survive this new reality. Notice how the author contrasts accommodationists, like the Sioux chief Red Cloud, who realized the overwhelming military might of the U.S. and tried to adapt his people to farming, with traditionalists like Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull famously refused to be confined to a reservation and openly mocked the idea of giving up his freedom to become what he called a slave to a piece of fat bacon and coffee. This was an agonizing, profoundly dividing choice for these once powerful communities.
So the really crucial point here is how the government deliberately handled these populations once they were actually confined. When you read about the boarding schools, reflect deeply on this quote from Richard Henry Pratt: "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." It is chilling, right? But it perfectly summarizes the era's brutal assimilation policy. You see, the goal wasn't just physical containment anymore, it was total cultural erasure. They forcibly took children away from their families, cut their hair, changed their indigenous names, and strictly forbade them from speaking their native languages or practicing their spiritual traditions, all under the incredibly dark guise of a civilizing education.
Now, this next concept is absolutely critical for your understanding of the chapter: the Dawes Act of 1887. The author vividly describes this legislation as a mighty pulverizing engine designed specifically to break up the bonds of the tribe. For the Plains Indians, the idea of individual private land ownership was a completely alien, almost nonsensical concept. But the true underlying motive of the Dawes Act wasn't merely to magically transform hunters into farmers. Actually, it was a legal mechanism to take the leftover, quote-unquote, surplus reservation land, after these small allotments were handed out, and quickly open it up to eager white settlers.
To put that into perspective, just look at the staggering drop from 138 million acres down to 48 million. The data visually proves exactly why historians consider the Dawes Act an absolute catastrophe for indigenous wealth and sovereignty. Through this single piece of legislation, Native Americans were legally stripped of nearly 2/3 of their remaining land across the entire country. It was a massive transfer of wealth and territory. Watch closely for the author's arguments on how this dispossession cemented Native poverty and fundamentally altered their ability to survive.
And finally, Theme 5, the final tragic resistance. We have reached the culmination of these federal policies in the late 1880s and 1890.
Pay very close attention to the ghost dance in your reading. Notice how the starving, dispossessed Sioux enthusiastically embraced this beautiful but desperate religious movement, started by a Paiute leader named Wovoka. It's so important to realize this was entirely nonviolent, a spiritual hope for a restored world where ancestors returned and the buffalo roamed once again. But watch how profoundly the white authorities and inexperienced Indian agents fundamentally misunderstood the whole thing. They saw the dancing and the fervent emotion, instantly panicked, and falsely assumed it was a violent militant uprising preparing for war.
As you approach the end of the chapter, I really want you to evaluate the heartbreaking evidence showing the desperate conditions on the reservations. Just read this powerful quote by Chief Red Cloud. Congress had arbitrarily cut their promised rations. Their assigned crops had completely failed in a harsh drought. Disease was running rampant through the camps. And the buffalo, their absolute lifeblood, were entirely gone. It was this intense starvation, combined with the government's panicked military response to the peaceful ghost dance, that led directly to the horrific massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. So as you complete your reading this week, I want you to keep this final, provocative question in mind. Think critically about the complex and, honestly, often tragic costs of the big picture of American history. We so often hear a simple, triumphant narrative of westward expansion, innovation, and progress. But what were the human costs of that progress? Remember, this explainer is meant to set the stage and prepare you for the reading, not replace it. I highly encourage you to read carefully, evaluate the historical evidence presented by the author, and really think about how the chapter answers the historical questions we've just explored together today. Enjoy the reading, think like historians, and I will see you all in class.